My name's Phil Wynne Owen, and I'm currently a member of the European Court of Auditors based in Luxembourg. But I should stress that today all the views I express are my own personal views and recollections of another job I did, and therefore they're not the views of the European Court of Auditors. As you say, I was Director General of Strategy, Information and Pensions at the Department for Work and Pensions for just over 4.5 years, from November 2004, arriving pretty much at the time of the Pensions Commission's first analytical report, through until June 2009. So I was the Director General, the Management Board member responsible, amongst other things, for all pensions policy, and therefore taking forward the work of the Pensions Commission.
When you were working at the Treasury, how much your role changed by moving from one department to another?
Well, I spent over 30 years of my career in the British Civil Service until I resigned and began my present job in the European Court of Auditors. Mm-hmm. In those 31 years, I did almost 20 years in the Treasury, but I also worked in 3 other government departments: the Cabinet Office, where I was Director of Regulatory Impact Unit, mm-hmm. DWP, where, as I've said, I was a board member responsible for pensions and strategy, mm-hmm. and also most recently, in the 5 years prior to 2013, I was Director General for Climate at the Unified Department of Energy and Climate. Mm-hmm. So I've worked across Whitehall, and I think the best way to answer your question is to say the civil service is a coherent professional organisation, mm-hmm. and therefore there are more similarities moving between departments than differences. Okay. But one example of a difference between the Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions was that I left a department in the Treasury of just under 1,000 people and moved to the management board of a department which, when I got to DWP, I think we had nearly 140,000 people. Mm. So I was one of 10 people managing a huge number of staff all over the country. And I had various management responsibilities with information, with strategy, as well as pensions, which meant that I had several thousand people all over the country working for me. Mm. So my role was very much that of a manager and leader, but also a strategist, making sure that the department working for its ministers was pursuing the right policies in the most strategic, sensible way, and implementing and delivering those policies. That felt on a much bigger scale than anything I'd done at the Treasury, which is very much a sort of policy department at the core, mm-hmm. of Whitehall. Yeah.
If you can remember, what were the main issues facing pension provision before the Pensions Commission?
The UK had obviously got a state pension scheme, mm-hmm. But generally, particularly in the private sector, people had relied for a long time very heavily on private sector provision, and particularly so-called defined benefit schemes, DB schemes. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was a very rapid shift by private companies out of defined benefit schemes into defined contribution, mm-hmm. the so-called DC schemes, mm-hmm. the big shift from DB to DC. The trouble was that for the citizens involved, those pensions were often a lot less generous. So the DB to DC shift was seeing a decline in the number of people enjoying private pensions, and a decline in the ultimate value of those private pensions, with more and more of the workforce being thrown back onto total reliance on the basic state pension, the state pension that you make your national insurance contributions to pay for. I think the number had gone up from somewhere in the 30% to somewhere in the 50% by the early 2000s. Now, the Labour government had taken steps to do what it could for the very poorest older people, for instance with the pension credit reform. But obviously when you introduce a degree of means testing, that can actually be a disincentive to private saving for those concerned or who may be able to benefit from something like the pension credit. So actually one of the effects was to possibly hasten this reliance on the state pension system and a decline in private provision. Now, there was a lot of concern about this switch in pension savings patterns. There was also a growing awareness of a major demographic trend, which was that by the millennium, we were all beginning to realise that people were living a lot longer. So the ageing society was a major challenge for many aspects of public policy, not just the health service, but also for pensions provision, because people weren't saving enough. Because typically we found that if you asked someone how long they were going to live, they would give you perhaps the average of how long their parents had lived, without remembering or realising that they should probably add 4 or 5 years to that. So you had a lot of older people heavily reliant on the state, that becoming ever more expensive for the state. The state trying to control the cost by means testing, but that in itself discouraged private saving, and in the private savings corporate market, a shift from DC to DC pensions, which was therefore less generous for the ultimate recipients. So many people termed this a growing pensions crisis, because you're going to have more and more old people reliant on the state going forward, and there was a recognition that something needed to be done about it. And that was what led the government, before my time in the relevant office, but back in, I think it was December 2002, the Pensions Commission, the Independent Pensions Commission, was set up by the then Secretary of State for DWP in a green paper. I came along a little bit later when the Independent Pensions Commission published its first report, which was purely analytical, seeking to get an agreed analysis of what was wrong with the system. That came out in October 2004, and I happened to arrive in my job in DWP in November 2004. So in a sense, I'd been sort of recruited by Sir Richard Mottram, the chief civil servant in the Department for Work and Pensions, who I think was particularly interested to get someone with central government experience. I was of the Treasury. I was coming from the Treasury Director of Financial Services post, so I knew a lot of the players in the financial services industry. People like Ottoton and Co were known to me, who's now chair here. And therefore, I think I was brought in with a background and a skill set that was relevant to the enormous task that Sir Richard Mottram and his ministers could see was coming, with the arrival of the analysis that was coming in from the Independent Pensions Commission, suggesting we had a big problem and that things needed to be done about it.
After describing these main issues, do you think that there was a real need for an independent review to address these problems?
Yes, I think the independent review methodology had a lot of advantages, and I could see why this was. I've always been fascinated to work on what I call the really big, hairy, difficult public policy issues, the long-term issues that involve both intergenerational and intra-generational cost transfers, particularly if you get them wrong. So I've worked a lot on issues like ageing and pensions, which we're talking about today, climate change, and nuclear decommissioning. Now, these are all the sorts of public policy issues that it's quite hard for politicians sometimes to give absolute focus to in the short term because of electoral considerations, cost considerations. But they're all issues that unless you tackle them properly today, or start tackling them properly today, you just end up transferring lots of cost onto future generations, our children and our grandchildren. So civil servants, who are hopefully in post a little bit longer than ministers, have an opportunity to focus on these really big public policy issues that it's a privilege to work on, but they're really difficult, like ageing, like climate. And one of the beauties of having an independent commission working on pensions reform was that it gave us some of that longer term view that's necessary to tackle these really big problems like ageing society, like pensions. I mean, just to give you an example, I've got huge respect for the politicians I actually worked with on this agenda. But during my 4 years and 7 months as Director General responsible for pensions in DWP, I actually counted up for you, I had 6 Secretaries of State during that time. I had Alan Johnson, David Blunkett, John Hutton, Peter Hain, James Purnell, and I think I overlapped with Yvette Cooper at the end for about a week. She arrived just in time for me to invite her to my farewell party because I was already due to go to my next job in climate. Now that shows how difficult it is for politicians to be around long enough to take that long view on an agenda sometimes. That said, they all got stuck into this agenda and ran with the same policy brief. But one of my jobs, and I would say one of Adair Turner's and the Commission's jobs, was to brief each of them as they arrived very quickly on what the emerging policy agenda was, why it was as it was, and how best we could contribute in government to pursue it. And I was lucky that in each case, perhaps fortunate, perhaps we had the right analysis that each of these politicians in turn bought in their own way to promoting this agenda and carrying it forward. And in particular, I'd like to mention there were 2 who perhaps had the longest tenure as Secretary of State while I was Director General. John Hutton, who was around for about 20 months, and James Purnell, who was around for about 16 months. Both of those did over a year and therefore were able to add, by definition, more value than some of the others in really making the agenda their own and working constructively with myself and my team of civil servants and with the Pensions Commission. Shall I tell you what I think special about an external reviewers? I'd begun when I was head of tax policy in the Treasury several years earlier and had introduced a lot of pensions reforms. I did Ken Clarke's last budget and Gordon Brown's first 3. So I introduced a lot of the green taxes. I began to use independent experts, reviewers, to work with my civil servants. So I was familiar with this model. But before I came to DWP, I'd never worked with more than one reviewer on one review. Yeah? Now we had an independent commission of 3 people, and I was intrigued to see how it would happen. Actually, it worked very well. I think Adair Turner, Jeannie Drake and John Hills complemented each other perfectly as a sort of policy making and analytical triangle. Also, I gathered that this was before my time, they'd been nominated from different corners of the ministerial triangle. I think number 10 had been keen on having Adair Turner as the chair. The Treasury had been keen to have Jeannie Drake with her trade unionist background, and DWP had been keen to have John Hills from the LSE with his analytical and social policy skills. And those 3 worked together extremely well. We put in a small secretariat headed by an excellent economist called Trevor Huddleston, who I then took back as a director to head my analytical and strategy section in DWP. But we made sure there were the right Chinese walls in place, so the commission was truly independent. And the beauty of external reviews when they work like this is that they've got, as I say, a longer time frame. They give you continuity of ownership of an agenda, particularly if you've got rapidly changing ministers. I think that's helpful. It's a public face. They bring great expertise of different sorts, as I explained. They can be very analytical. They present themselves as apolitical, or at least politically balanced. As I said, they were sort of nominated by different parts of government. They can afford to raise issues that are sometimes very difficult for anyone else to raise. So at the start of this process, indeed I would say when I arrived in DWP and until we received their second report with conclusions and recommendations in 2005, it was very difficult to make the point to people that because we were living longer, they should work longer so that the proportion of time they spent in retirement was pretty much the same as their parents. Otherwise, if we all spend longer in retirement than previous generations. All we're doing is, unless we have adequate pension, is asking our children and their children to support us, yeah? So you get this intra-generational wealth transfer, which isn't necessarily a great idea for young people, at least. Now, that issue of, therefore, raising the state pension age was an unspoken must. And one of the beauties of the Pensions Commission was they began to produce analysis, particularly in their first report, that made it clear that people were living longer, that made it clear that people had got inadequate savings, that made it clear that an adequate state pension was going to be unaffordable for the nation in and on its own. So people did need private pensions. And therefore they got a whole debate going, which included the dawning realisation that people would have to work longer and take their state pension at a later age because they were going to live longer. So that ability to raise the unthinkable, and then politicians can start talking about it too, but it opens doors. They also did, the other thing they did, which was great, was a lot of open consensus building activity, which perhaps we can talk about in a moment.
Was this analysis helpful for you as a senior official?
So I think this was also an example of British government at its best in the most generic sense of, I'm a great believer in using expertise, in trusting the experts, but asking them difficult questions, and having so-called fact-based policy analysis. And I came from the Treasury, where we'd used a lot of fact-based policy and analytical approach, a lot of modelling, obviously, etc. And I was delighted when I came to DWP to find that Adair Turner's Pensions Commission, and with John Hills, an LSE economist, and social policy expert, and Jeannie Drake, who was very analytical, were all pursuing, just wanting to know the facts and understand the nature of the problem first. And so as I arrived, we received this first report from them, which was, I think, over 300 pages, which was basically just an analysis of the UK's pension system and the ageing society challenge. And I thought that that was very high quality, and I wasn't the only one. Public commentators and academics said so too, many stakeholders. And that was based, for instance, increasingly as their work went forward on the Pensim 2 model that Trevor Huddleston and other analysts in DWP had built. I should say that the Secretariat of the Pensions Commission, the people they relied on to run the numbers and do the modelling, was led by Trevor Huddleston, who was a senior DWP economist. As I say, there were Chinese walls established, but they were using this model, Pensim 2, that had been developed in DWP. So there was first-rate analysis. Now, Adair Turner himself came from McKinsey's and CBI background. John Hills was an academic. Jeannie Drake always asked the right questions. So they obviously grilled the model and the experts very thoroughly. But what we ended up with was a comprehensive piece of analysis of the state of the pension system and the state of the ageing society that laid out very clearly the challenges and which was socialised, I'll talk about consensus building in a moment, in a way that got everyone to buy into the fact there was a problem. Obviously you then move forward to say, well, what are we going to do about it? But the analysis of the problem was the first thing that the Pensions Commission sought to establish, and that was immensely useful to me as an arriving new Director General in DWP to pretty much in my first month get on my desk this tome of high quality research saying this is the problem, or these are the problems, Phil. Yeah? And I was also fortunate that a year later-ish, to November 2005, they produced their second report with their conclusions and recommendations.
What do you think made this piece of work reach consensus among pension industry, trade unions, citizens?
Okay, maybe this is the moment to say I'm a great believer in a civil service and government that innovates, and I think at the heart of the success of this project were three big innovations. Yeah, one was, we've already discussed, using external reviewers for all the reasons we discussed of long-term gain independence, etc. Secondly was an open consensus building approach which included innovations like deliberative polling. I'll come back to that in a moment. And thirdly, at the heart of the policy solution was some core behavioural economics. So independent commission, consensus building using deliberative polling, and behavioural economics are the three key messages I want to leave with you. Both myself and the team of civil servants I work with were committed to a more open consultative approach. Was just going back a little bit, when I was head of the budget and tax policy in the Treasury, I'd worked with Gordon Brown as Chancellor to make the formerly very secretive budget policy making approach, tax measures, a lot more open and collaborative. We'd sort of basically taken the Chancellor's old red box and begun consulting on tax measures before actually doing them in many cases, like green measures. So I believed in using outside experts. So I believed in civil service that faces outwards and consults with people and liaised with people and designs the best policy collaboratively with stakeholders and citizens, not secretly. So did Adair Turner, given his McKinsey's background, and Jeannie Drake and John Hills. So the Pensions Commission followed a very open approach. For instance, they organised in the Excel Centre in Docklands a big stakeholders event that was really quite risky, with 80 or 90 key stakeholders, where they, for a whole day, they took people through chunks of the policy analysis just to get a buy-in to this fundamental analysis of the problem, and that worked very well. And it meant that many stakeholders, be it the trades unions or the industrial representatives of the CBI or the EEF, for instance, began to buy in and began to take brave decisions to support the policy with their own members who maybe stood to lose from it. I mean, one of the interesting things, the reason for consensus building was because it was a sort of policy where everyone had to contribute something, or you could say everyone lost something. I mean, employers had to face the prospect of compulsory contributions to auto-enrolment. Trades unionists had to face the fact they may have to work longer before they got their state pension. And the Treasury, at the heart of government, had to recognise that it maybe needed more of the tax base going to pay for pensions going forward, which meant earnings-related restoration of the basic state pension. So in a way, everyone had to give. So that's why you needed to build this big tent consensus. Now, the government, for its part, and the Secretaries of State I work with, particularly John Hutton and James Pennell, bought into the idea of having a national pensions debate. They realised that the analysis, and then a year later the recommendations that Adair Turner were giving them, would be impossible to deliver unless you could create cross-party consensus around this big reform and cross-stakeholder consensus. So not only did the Pensions Commission organise its own consultative events like the Excel event, the government team itself, with myself leading the civil service side, began to organise a sort of national roadshow to cities across the UK, taking the Pensions Commission analysis and seeing what people thought and explaining it to them. And I think possibly the most exciting day of my whole time in the job was National Pensions Day, which was the 18th of March 2006, which was a deliberative polling event on a large scale. We had over 1,000 citizens chosen deliberately by random technique, ranging from the age of 16 to in their 90s, and from social categories A to E. So it was a real mix of the population, both young people concerned about their future pensions and old people already well in receipt of pensions, sitting at tables together in 6 different sites. Both educational lectures from people like Adair Turner, and you have to choose the educational content of these events very carefully, but also with things to try and make because if you invite people to come and discuss pensions with you for a day, most people are going to run a mile. So we had something to warm them up called a pensions pub quiz. which would do things like say, how long do you think you're going to live? Is it, till you're 70, till you're 80, or till you're 85 or whatever? And, and people were using electronic voting techniques. Now, in those days, this was all very progressive. And I saw 16-year-olds helping 90-year-olds, how to work the voting gizmo at the table. But what was very interesting was we took their views on whether people were saving enough, for instance, for their pensions at the start of the day. And we pretty much asked them the same questions at the end of the day. And we saw, even in the course of a day's sort of education, discussion and realisation by people about, for instance, how they were going to live longer than they'd expected and how their savings were perhaps lower than they needed as a result, we saw a real marked shift in opinion and people coming round to a recognition that some of these unmentionables, like how long you'd have to work if you were going to live longer, needed to be discussed and addressed. And that deliberative polling event was one of the first of its kind in terms of UK policy making. Yeah. It's interesting to see what it's led to, because in the context of the current debate, which I'm not going to touch on, I see some people are now advocating so-called citizens' assemblies, which is the same idea developed further 10 years later. These are expensive events to organise, and they also need to be prepared in a very careful way. So the quality of analysis and the presentation of facts needs to be very objective and neutral and trusted. And we were lucky in the Pensions Commission, we had that firm analytical base that we could use for that deliberative polling event. But I'm particularly proud that DWP was able to organise that event as the sort of fulcrum of the national pensions debate, and that brought the consensus and meant that we were operating, when we came forward subsequently to enact the core proposals from the Pensions Commission. There'd been some changes, but basically the government bought into the core of the package. When we brought forward the Pensions Act 2007 and the Pensions Act 2008, first one did the sort of state pension reforms and the second one did the so-called MPSS, private pensions automatic enrolment scheme with the compulsory employer's contribution. There was broad political consensus from all the major political parties in the House of Commons to support the policy, which is quite striking when you talk about that. And that was because of this open, collaborative, reaching out, having the debate, presenting the facts, consensus building approach that we took.
What struck you most on that day?
We did it in the 6 big cities. I think we had 1,000 people across 6 big cities, joined up by video links, because obviously the presenters couldn't all be in one place. So I went to the one in Newcastle, I think, and I sort of sat at a table and took part, and I moved around a bit. But I think the most inspiring thing was literally, I think I've mentioned it already, seeing a sort of young person still in their teens, sitting next to and befriending someone in their 80s or 90s, to see generations and people from different social backgrounds working together on a problem that you never would have imagined you could have got a bunch of British citizens to sit down and discuss seriously and learn about for a whole day. I mean, because most people regard pensions as boring. We'll come on to the behavioural economics, but most people would rather do anything than talk about pensions all day, which was why we had to sort of make it fun and accessible and have a pensions pub quiz and, applause for the table that answered most our questions correctly and stuff. So the whole thing was really quite, for those of us who'd been working on it for some time in a government department, it was really quite inspiring to reach out and work with citizens on a difficult public policy problem and share the problem and begin to do both a bit of education and collective learning and understand where people had points of resistance or difficulty. And that, in a sense, fed and informed our communications programme that was very extensive going forward. And in that we were very lucky, and the politicians we had, people like James Pennell, now at the BBC, great communicator, was very important in the latter stages of my time in DWP in actually explaining and promoting the policy.
Do you think the use of behavioral economics, it worked for pensions?
Yes, I think it worked for pensions.
Okay.
I don't think it always works. I think it's really difficult. So at times I've tried to apply it in climate policy and found it very difficult to get people, for instance, to insulate their homes. You know, but I think it's a very exciting new awareness on the part of policy officials that, you know, as against the traditional instruments of taxation, expenditure, regulation, you've now got behavioural economics that can use features of all those other three instruments in an intelligent way that goes with the grain of human behaviour. So a lot of us, yes, we're reading our nudge, we're chatting to the relevant academics, we're interpreting how we could use our analytical base, how we could use market research, how we could use things like deliberative polling to really understand why people sometimes do not behave in a rational economic manner, particularly in terms of their own long-term saving and pensions, where the evidence was increasingly compelling that because people found pensions boring and difficult to understand. I mean, the complexity of the state pension system, for instance, huge deterrent to anyone to try and really understand what they were going to get in 20 or 30 years' time. But also, you know, people have got many natural pressing problems in their lives today that they need to pay for. People need to survive today, and politicians are naturally, with an electoral focus, focused on how wealthy or not people feel today. So the incentives aren't always there in the system, be it for the political system and or the electorate, to really think long term about what income they'll need in many years' time, when they'll be very vulnerable if they're getting older and have health needs, etc. So behavioural economics exposed why people weren't saving enough for private pensions in addition to their state pension, and the fact there was an over-reliance on the state pensions system, which no one really understood anyway out there, just sort of felt that it might be enough. But the analysis showed that it probably wouldn't be enough, except at excessive cost of the public sector. Those of us who'd been in government for some time and had a traditional rational economic man or woman view of policy making began to learn that human behaviour was often irrational on issues like pension saving. It opened our minds to the fact that we had to not only allow for people's myopia and inertia, but actually turn those around so that we could use their short-sightedness, their myopia, use their inertia, their unwillingness to actually take decisions in favour of them doing the right thing rather than against them doing the right thing. And that came to the sort of one big shiny idea of the policy proposals from the Pensions Commission was automatic enrolment into employer low cost pension scheme. So you're putting people into something that was value for money, but with the option for them to opt out. That meant that the inertia that most people naturally have about taking big financial decisions, like changing your bank, for instance, most people don't. The inertia that governed most people's behaviour worked in their favour once they were auto-enrolled, because they were disinclined to opt out, and therefore there was a public good being secured both for them and for society as a whole, because for the first time in many of their lives they'd be saving into a low-cost private pension scheme to top up whatever they were going to get from the state subsequently. Because once they went into a job, if their employer was committed to the scheme, they were told they were going to be auto-enrolled unless they opted out. So it just sort of happened for most people because of inertia, and it overcame their myopia. So you've got these forces of irrational behavioural economics working in the favour of the citizen rather than against his or her best interests. And that was the sort of, alongside using external reviewers, which you could just describe as a mechanism of government, and alongside consensus building and deliberative polling, which again is a sort of tool really, the big shiny policy idea was built around the behavioural economics of auto-enrolment with opt-out and a compulsory employer contribution.
When you were at the DWP, there was also another idea which was about informed choice. How auto-enrollment was combined with an informed choice.
So one thing we were doing was not only using the traditional tools of government like economics and statistics, as we used extensively to build the analytical fact base, which was the subject of the Pensions Commission's first report, but as we evolved the policy, I was very keen. I'm a London Business School MBA by background, so I believe in multidisciplinary team working. So I was very keen that behavioural economics and informed choice, etc., took us into areas which civil servants and arguably some ministers knew very little about, which was marketing and social policy analysis and understanding people's behaviours by doing market research. And so we began to use a range of new and different disciplines to help us understand how you communicate with people. I've mentioned obviously the National Pensions Day, but also what's very important when people buy into a product or recognise they've got a product on joining a company, say, is the language used and the communications used to inform them that they're part of a new scheme. So the concept of how we would, and remember at the time there was a lot of concern in the financial services sector about mis-selling scandals of the past, and a lot of people, good people like Otto Thorensen, were doing everything they could to sort of overcome that legacy of the past and to focus on clarity of communication with people. So it was very important that if people were going to make choices about whether to opt out or not, their choices were informed by appropriate, simple but not misleading literature. So a lot of work was developed to go into that. Now we also recognised that those were not the traditional skills of the civil service, and that devising the literature around a new pensions product like this would be the task of an expert body. So one of the things I was responsible with my team in doing was making sure that we built and prepared not only the legislation to get the powers to do what we wanted to do, which we were obviously experienced at doing because we were civil servants used to taking bills through the House of Commons with our ministers, but also we built expert bodies. We created a non-departmental public body that was initially called the Personal Accounts Delivery Authority, PADA, with a view to that being a sort of transitional body for 3 to 4 years, which would evolve into the corporation called Nest, where we're talking today. Because we recognised that we would need to recruit people with a background in those sorts of communication skills and expertise and financial products that we as civil servants didn't all have, or that you'd need at least a blend of people. So one of the things that I was heavily involved with as Director General was making sure we had the right people in the right place doing the right things. I was often first on site with new ministers. I remember when, for instance, David Blunkett was appointed suddenly and surprisingly in May 2005. I was sort of rung overnight, and I was in with him first thing the next morning, briefing him on the Pensions Commission and its emerging proposals, and getting him on the phone to Adair Turner to talk and to say how much he looked forward to working with him. So I had to get ministers aligned with the policy. I had to have the right quality civil servants in place. I had to, and in creating new bodies like PADO, I spent a lot of time making sure we got, I think initially we had Paul Miners as chairman, but then he became a Treasury Minister, so we made Jeannie Drake, who was coming out of the Pensions Commission, acting chairwoman. And we found Tim Jones from the private sector with a lot of relevant banking and IT skills to help take PADA through the very difficult phase of building a different sort of organisation from a traditional government department, non-departmental public body, and then subsequently that's evolved further to Nest as it currently is with a lot of private sector, but also some of the best civil servants have migrated across, like Helen Dean and Caroline Rooks, people I work with on the policy. So there's some continuity of civil service expertise, but there's an awful lot of private sector relevant skills and expertise working at the heart now. I think when you're building a policy like this, you need the multidisciplinary team approach is making sure you've got the right people with the right skills at the right times, and therefore blending as you have a long period of history. We're talking about almost 20 years now from the inception in December 2002 to now in 2019. The development of this policy has obviously gone through a number of phases.
So this blend was another one success factor.
So yes, you could say that. It's part of a mechanism.
It was not contradictory or problematic for the civil servants.
Yeah. Obviously, when different people work together in multidisciplinary teams, be it a journalist and a sound recorder or whatever, you get your tensions, but you don't get a good product unless you find ways of working creatively together. And I think it was the job of the leadership, be it ministers, the Pensions Commission, myself and my team, to role model that the crisis, the pensions crisis, the challenge was so great that we needed to work together in a collaborative, open way, and that's what we sought to do.
I see.
Not to say there weren't tensions. I think one of the interesting things looking back was there were naturally tensions within government. I mean, you can only, I think Adair Turner said, an independent pensions commission can only take things so far. You can make recommendations and conclusions, but you can't actually implement. You need ministers to buy in, and obviously within the government there were tensions. But actually looking back, and at times they felt pretty rough. There was a lot of reporting about the tensions between number 10 and number 11. Actually looking back, and maybe with the benefit of hindsight, and as a former Treasury official, so I sort of understood what was going on there. I actually think that the traditional tensions between number 10 and number 11 were very creative in this case, because there were clearly affordability concerns and concerns about making sure that poverty was addressed at the Treasury and long-term affordability. And there were concerns about fixing the emerging ageing society and pensions shortfall, particularly in private pensions from number 10. And then there was the Department for Work and Pensions, where I found myself working, which had a lot of analytical expertise and data, and a lot of very committed civil servants keen to do the right thing in terms of public policy. And that triangle had its tensions, but actually I think out of it we got a good product. So, vigorous debate within government can be a very good thing if it's managed in a way that keeps going forward and gets results. And I think that in this case the creative tensions were actually productive, and the independent reviewers helped by bringing in this sort of impartial, neutral analysis of the problem, which meant no one could say there wasn't a problem once they'd established the analytical base. And they brought in proposals, many of which were very attractive to many civil servants and politicians, like the behavioural economics. The auto-enrolment with opt-out was brought into by all the major parties, as far as I remember. I may be wrong, but I think all the big three parties, Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrats, all supported it as the bill went through.
How Treasury helped to resolve this tension?
I think what the base analysis had shown was that the fact that people were living longer and the fact that more and more people were thinking, oh, well, I'll have to rely on the state pension, and the fact that private pensions were changing from DB to a less generous DC, meant that the Treasury long-term was staring down the barrel of a very costly equation anyway. So I think Treasury officials who we obviously kept very closely in touch with, and the Chancellor and his team, who I knew from having worked with them previously, understood the analytical base was there was a problem. Then the debate was obviously about how exactly it was addressed. It was difficult for the Treasury to agree to the thing that they had to make the biggest concession on, which was restoring the earnings link of the basic state pension. But when you looked at the whole analysis, it was fairly clear that with the proportion of the population that was over 65, something like doubling in a relatively short historic period, you were going to have to spend more of the tax base on the state pension anyway. But you also clearly needed as much more private provision, and that's where the idea of Nest and auto-enrolment with opt-out came in. So the sort of package worked, and Treasury officials, I mean, I obviously cut me in half, and I've still got HM Treasury somewhere inside me. So I think Treasury officials are always very rational and very convinced by good analysis and modelling and argument and the open collaborative approach. I think, yes, there were many debates with them, but over time, I think the core of the Turner Commission's analysis persuaded them that there were measures in here that had broad support and that needed to be done in the interest of the public good, but also to keep the public bill down in the longer term. Otherwise you'd get very high pressures on the public purse of an unexpected nature going forward as more and more people aged and found they didn't have enough for their retirement. It was interesting thinking back to how it worked. Yeah, it's one of the few things I've done in my working life where I'm really proud of the contribution the civil service was able to make to what I think was a good piece of government.